This can even be known as a hypothesis. It is statistical and looks for common patterns within the different branches of social studies at the educational level. Since this closely relates to the scientific method, the results of this method are often taken as fact and/or science. Science is what scientists have done, not what a philosopher tells us the scientists meant to do. We're really doing or should have done is a good quote as to the explanation behind science and the scientific method. As seen here, observation can be brought about, and the method can be led by inquiry-based learning, which is a huge part of social studies today and a huge part of science. So inquiry-based learning can create an observation, research, and a hypothesis or question, experiments to gather to research that hypothesis to be true by collecting data analysis and then eventually having the conclusion to compare the hypothesis to the experiments and results. This quote also means true history cannot be altered if in fact it took place. It is factually proven to be true through the gathering of data that has been driven by inquiry, which in turn proves it as factual. Its origins. According to Margot Anderson in her essay entitled Quantitative History, Quantification and Experiment from the University of Minnesota, she explains that the term became popular in the 1950s through the 1960s because there was a need for the development of a social science history of which scientific method was taken and used to discover historic problems that had not been discovered yet. Not that quantitative history wasn't around or created, but in fact it was actually used more so in the United States around the 1950s and 1960s. One thing and one way that quantitative history is still used today is in the first settlement of Jamestown, the English settlement in the United States. This is still an archaeological site today where scientists are still gathering data and discovering new history through this data and experiments in science that's being enacted and used in this area in Virginia today. How it is planned to be used in education today. Quantitative history is currently at the forefront of social studies under the framework of Common Core. Social studies itself is not alone in having its own standards, but rather are connected to ELA, or English. These standards have been based around 5 major strategies that teachers used when teaching social studies today. These include reading, citing and interpreting sources, argument and explanatory writing, conducting research, and practicing democracy with speaking and listening. Furthermore, the National Cohort for Social Studies, or NCSS, in 2013 can be credited for coming up with these 5 strategies and being adopted by the Common Core. But at the forefront of all of this is divergent thinking. So how I would convey the specific tenets of the school of thought through quantitative learning and quantitative history, I should say, is through divergent thinking. Now, divergent thinking is an idea generation technique, such as brainstorming, in which an idea is followed in several directions to lead to one or more new ideas, which in turn lead to still more ideas. And this is a definition from thebusinessdictionary.com. According to Business Journal on Creative Innovation and Management, divergent thinking ability is crucial for successful creative problem solving, whether it be in the context of problem finding, solution finding, or in solution implementation. So if one student, for example, out of 30 came up with 3 different separate ideas on a specific problem within history, and then times that by 30, 3 times 30, 90 different ideas is a huge, gold mine of information, ideas, and history to be talked about in a classroom. And really is student-led and student-centered, which is what we're trying to do as teachers today, is to teach them to be self-regulated learners. Quantitative research in civics specifically is conducting research on different forms of government and how they compare to one another under the topic of civil equality today. One way I've done this recently and just finished up doing this is observing totalitarian governments versus democracy, while answering the question on how the government can affect our daily lives on a day-to-day basis in comparison to the two, or even further, how they affect the lives of individuals back then. So totalitarian governments like the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, or even Cuba, and how they sway public opinion through the use of propaganda and communism, as opposed to Theodore Roosevelt and his swaying public opinion through multiple avenues of leadership and through a series of checks and balances. Quantitative research in history. One way I like to use the process of quantitative history is by having my students conduct research and further having a student lead class discussions through things like Socratic seminars, where they can openly practice democracy by speaking and listening to others, which further supports divergent thinking. Finally, quantitative research in economics. One way I have my students use quantitative research via economics in my AP/IB History of the Americas class by giving data on how economics different from president to president. The biggest tool I use is Bill Clinton versus Ronald Reagan. Students are to gather data from both presidents as well as compare and contrast the two. We normally have a small class debate in class, as well as it can be pretty interesting as to what they come up with, because one side would, a huge portion of my class is conservative and the other portion is more so liberal, so them defending how they feel about these presidents and how they supposedly rejuvenated or built up or even tore down our nation's economy during the time period. Here are my references. And that's it.